Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 10, Section 1, the debate on the Reconstruction. So here we go. We're going to talk a little bit about the Reconstruction, and the Reconstruction was really this time period following the Civil War until about the beginning of 1876. And we're going to talk a little bit about what happens in between those 12 years. The Reconstruction, the whole goal of this was to bring back the South into the Union. And it didn't happen immediately after the ending of the war. And we're going to have to go through some good times and bad times, maybe a little more bad times than good times, to kind of explain what happens here. So to understand the Reconstruction, you kind of have to understand that there were more than one type of Reconstruction. There was Abraham Lincoln's Reconstruction, Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction, and something known as the Radical Reconstruction or Military Reconstruction. So to help you understand, Abraham Lincoln's Reconstruction, basically under his plan, 10% of the population of the states in rebellion, meaning the Confederate States, would have to swear loyalty to the United States so that their state could be readmitted to the Union. At that point in time, then people would have, particularly men, would have the right to be allowed to vote again. Okay, sounds pretty easy. That 10% or the 10% of the people who voted basically, or the 10% of the population during the election of 1860s. So you wouldn't have as many people, obviously, in 1860 population-wise than you would had, let's say, in 1867 or so. Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction. His plan was basically very similar to Lincoln's, but Johnson, for the most part, had some disagreements. He openly clashed with Congress over the Freedmen's Bureau, which we're going to talk about, the 14th Amendment, and military reconstruction, and something known as the Tenure of Office Act, which eventually is going to lead Johnson to become very well noted in American history as being the first president to be impeached. And then finally, radical reconstruction, aka sometimes known as military reconstruction. This is a plan in which the radical Republicans wanted to punish the South. They definitely wanted to protect the rights of African Americans or blacks. They wanted to prolong the Republican Party's dominance throughout the nation, including the South. And they wanted to shift the balance of power in Washington, really from the president or the executive branch to the legislative branch. So let's take a look at your sheet here and follow along. How did the emancipation affect the South's agricultural system? And one of the things that you have to understand is that through agriculture or the agricultural system, really emancipation threw it into a state of chaos because there were no slaves to do the work. What's going to have to happen is that slaves are going to have to, basically be accepted as paid labor. So African Americans, are going to have to be paid for the work that they're doing on some of these plantations or farms, okay, and not necessarily being put into a state of servitude. Number two, the purpose of the Reconstruction, for the most part, was to rebuild the land and the lives of the people of our nation, particularly those that were in the Deep South. Number three, how did Lincoln want the North and the South to be reunited? And a lot of this goes down to the fact that he really wanted to kind of bring everybody back together pretty quickly. He wanted to reconcile the two sides instead of punishing the South for treason. It's like, let's just get on and live happily ever after. So, what were the three goals of our radical Republicans? Our radical Republicans wanted to prevent Confederate leaders from assuming power. They wanted to make the Republican Party dominant in the South. And they also wanted to help African Americans achieve equality. All of these are really great ideas, but they're a little harder to do. You got to change the hearts of people. A lot of people in the North were under the assumption that Confederate leaders could eventually get back into power and kind of stir up trouble. And so radical Republicans wanted to keep them out of politics as much as they could, and they did. Guys like Jefferson Davis actually left the United States. He actually went to Great Britain for a time, just to kind of lay low, if you want to call it that. Robert E. Lee, he was kind of demoted in the sense that he couldn't vote, he couldn't hold any elected offices. So, you take two of the well-known leaders and you kind of squash them from ever achieving anything of dominance again. Let's talk a little bit about the Wade-Davis bill. You can see these two men pictured below here. You have Representative Benjamin Wade and Representative Henry Davis. In the summer of 1864, before the Civil War even ends, these men and many of their followers in Congress were trying to get a bill passed. And it's really, in a sense, it's kind of like their form of Reconstruction, but it never really came to be because obviously Lincoln is going to block this. But what it would have called for is that white males that were living in Confederate states would have to take an oath of allegiance to the United States. And Confederate states would have to hold constitutional conventions to create new state governments. And finally, each state that's in the South would have to hold a convention that would eventually lead to the abolishment of slavery. Okay, you got to remember 1864, this is before the passage of the 13th Amendment. And what eventually is going to happen is that we're going to add that to the Constitution, and eventually that's going to be part of the Reconstruction where they're going to have to agree to that. But this was kind of ahead of that. They also, if you were a Confederate state, had to reject all the debts that you had acquired under the Confederacy, and they couldn't allow those former Confederate officials or military officers the right to vote or the right to hold any elected offices. Lincoln blocked this bill by using what we call a pocket veto. And what a pocket veto basically does is you only have like a certain number of days to sign a bill into a law. And it's usually 10 days or such. And what he basically did is he had this legislation on his desk passed by Congress, and he never signed it. He just let the number of days expire, and then as a result, the bill dies right there on the desk. And certainly that was not necessarily popular with a lot of Republicans, particularly radical Republicans. But he did that with the hopes of maybe trying to kind of maybe soften the blow of rejoining our union together. All right, number 6. What were the tasks of the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands? And their goal was to feed, clothe, for the most part, war refugees in the South using old Union Army surpluses, and also to help freed people find work on plantations. And a lot of times these freed people were going to be working like sharecroppers. They would be paid or given a share of the crop that they would eventually have to sell and such. Okay, number 7. One of the lasting and important contributions of the Freedmen's Bureau was the fact that we had a lot of it worked closely with Northern Charities to help educate formerly enslaved African Americans. It provided housing for schools, so we could, actually find localities to start up a school. It paid teachers, and it also helped establish colleges. What's noted is, if you look at the illustration kind of in the bottom right-hand corner, is that many of these schools that were initially started right when the war ends, the student bodies included multi-generations. So you would have had what would have been your typical school-age children along with their parents and possibly their grandparents. So all of that was considered to be a great bonus of using the Freedmen's Bureaus to have that possibility of learning how to read and to write. The Black Codes, what were they? Well, this is kind of a sad situation here. Black Codes were laws that were primarily written at the state level that severely limited the rights of African Americans after the Civil War. And what we're going to find is over the course between 1865 and really to the kind of the middle of the 19th or the 20th century, there are going to be a lot of black codes that are going to be kind of on the books throughout the United States. And you don't necessarily have to go into the Deep South to find these. There were black codes that were written in areas in the North. Cities had certain rules about how African Americans would be housed, or whether or not they could obtain education in a school with white students. All of that was kind of in there to kind of put African Americans maybe in their place, and in a way, preventing them from enjoying the liberties that they were granted under the Constitution. We're going to take a look at some of these black codes here in just a moment. But number 9, what rights did African Americans gain from the Civil Rights Act of 1866? And what this would have done is it would have allowed African Americans to own property and to be treated as equals in the courts. The Civil Rights Act also would have granted citizenship. And what's interesting is, there were some concerns among some politicians that if we went ahead and we passed this act, that the Supreme Court wouldn't necessarily rule in its favor. And so members of Congress went ahead and took the initiative of drawing up the 14th Amendment, which would allow for African Americans to have citizenship, but it also would allow them to have due process of law at the state level. And that's really kind of the big thing that the 14th Amendment does today, is this idea of due process of law, meaning that states have to follow certain rules in guidance of the U.S. Constitution. They can't be in violation of that. And so you see a lot of Supreme Court cases today that use the 14th Amendment as a result of that. All right, I was mentioning a moment ago that we were going to talk about some of these black codes, and these were pretty harsh, and the punishments were pretty severe. African Americans who would break these rules, they could be sent to to jail, or in some cases even worse, lynched. So some examples here: blacks could not meet without a white person being present. Blacks could not sit on juries or testify against whites. Blacks could be hanged for things like stealing a bale of cotton or a horse or a mule. Blacks could not buy or rent farmland. They must have a special license to take any job but a farm laborer. So these are things that obviously we're going to put African Americans kind of in their place, and to keep them tied really to a subservient kind of lifestyle, which is really, really sad. Number 10, how did the radical Republicans respond to attacks on them by President Johnson? Got to remember, Johnson becomes president as a result of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Johnson is kind of a unique case because he was the only member of Congress who was from the South. He was from the state of Tennessee, who stayed loyal to the Union during the time of the Civil War. Johnson was a Democrat. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. So it was kind of an interesting ticket in 1864 that he would even be allowed to be on there. But Lincoln saw this as an opportunity of making it easier to reunite the nation, not knowing that he would be assassinated. So radical Republicans basically accused the Democrats of being traitors and for having started the Civil War. And since Johnson was a Democrat, he was seen as a traitor, and he was seen as being responsible for starting the war, even though this guy remained loyal to the Union. He is attacked and vilified. So, number 11, we're going to talk a little bit about the results of the Military Reconstruction Act, which basically was passed in 1867. For the most part, it divided the Confederacy into 5 different military districts, and you can kind of see those. You had Virginia as a district, the Carolinas were a district, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida were a district. Tennessee was not, because they had already been readmitted to the Union, but Arkansas and Mississippi were a district, and then Texas and Louisiana. And as a result of this, each former Confederate state had to hold a constitutional convention. They had to guarantee the right to vote to all adult male citizens. including African Americans. They had to obviously abolish slavery. That was a given. Each state had to ratify the 14th Amendment before they could actually select members to go to Congress. And during this time period, you had states like North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, and Arkansas that were readmitted to the Union. States like Mississippi and Texas, for example, Virginia, were not readmitted because they never accepted those conditions. So, number 12. Why did 7 Republican senators join the Democrats in refusing to convict President Johnson of high crimes and misdemeanors? It all goes back to this thing called the Tenure of Office Act. And I want to talk a little bit about that, but I am going to reveal what I have up here so you can kind of write as I talk. In basically 1868, members of Congress were a little concerned that President Johnson was going to kind of squash some of their plans with presidential vetoes. And so what they wanted to do is to make sure that President Johnson couldn't fire members of his cabinet without getting permission from the U.S. Senate. And so they ended up passing the Tenure of Office Act. And it basically said that the president, for the most part, if he wanted to fire somebody, he had to get Senate approval to remove members of his cabinet or any government official. And that would basically mean that he would have to have the support of Congress. And for the most part, he didn't, because he was a Democrat and Congress, for the most part, were Republicans. Johnson got really mad and he fired one of the guys who instigated this, and that was Secretary of War Stanton, Edwin Stanton. And as a result of that, Stanton is fired on February 21st, 1868. Stanton barricades himself into his offices, refuses to leave. Eventually, he is removed over a period of time. But within days, the House of Representatives, using their congressional power or using their constitutional power, they file charges of high crimes and misdemeanors against President Johnson and vote to impeach him. Okay, the House is the only house in the Congress that can actually initiate an impeachment of a president or any government official. It could be a Supreme Court justice or such, but it is the U.S. Senate that holds the trial. And so in the spring of 1868, we have a trial that's being held in the U.S. Senate. And what ends up happening is that Johnson might have been impeached, but he is not found guilty. So as far as our Republican senators who joined the Democrats, they believe that it would set a dangerous precedent to remove a president from office just because he didn't agree with the policy. And so our members of the Senate fell short of this conviction. Johnson finishes up his term. We have an election in 1868. And what ends up happening is Ulysses Grant runs for president and becomes your next president. But needless to say, Johnson's going to be your first president to be impeached. There has only been one other president who has had to face impeachment and also survived conviction from the U.S. Senate, and that was Bill Clinton in the 1990s. Number 13, what did the 15th Amendment declare? It basically said that the right to vote shall not be deprived on account of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. So in other words, African American males would have the right to vote. 14, how did white Southerners respond to the radical Reconstruction? And many white Southerners began to fight back against what they saw were unjust federal government policies. And hence, we're going to have a showdown. Thank you very much.